it is remarkable to have been in this place now for my fourth Michaelmas, and I'm really beginning to feel a connection to this community and to the striving of threefold. I have to say the other event that had happened just before that first Michaelmas, if I'm remembering correctly, was that Sunbridge had just kind of closed its doors. And so that mood was also living here, and yet the mood that came out of that event was this sense of renewal, of actually reconnecting to the founders of this community and their impulses as a source for renewal. And I found that very inspiring, and I'm thrilled to have been able to be part of the ongoing series of events. So I was reminded in preparing for this talk and preparing for this event, I was reminded of a story that I'm sure some of you know, maybe many of you know. It's a story from the life of the great teacher of Chartres, Alanis Abensalis. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. But the story goes that Alanis was preparing to give a talk in Paris. He had actually traveled to Paris, and he was going to give a talk on the nature of the Trinity. And that day he was out walking, preparing for his talk, and he was out walking by the Seine River, and he came upon a little boy who was sitting next to the river, and the little boy had a kind of a cup, and he was scooping out water from the river and pouring it out onto the bank of the river. And Alanis walked up to this little boy and he said, "Now just what are you doing, young man?" And he said, "I'm emptying the Seine River." And Alanis said, "You can't empty the Seine River one cup at a time." And this little boy looked at Alanis, turned and looked at him in the eye and said, "Alanis, I can no more empty the Seine River one cup at a time than you can speak on the nature of the Trinity this evening." Apparently this story is true, and apparently that evening Alanis showed up for his talk, and he said, "Friends, you will have to be satisfied with simply seeing Alanis this evening." He stood there a moment, he walked off the stage, he then renounced his role as a teacher and became a hermit, and continued to play a very important role in the church as a hermit. But I'm reminded of this story because, for one reason, because the topic of spiritual research is so daunting in our movement. Yeah, it's so grand and lofty. And this invitation from Jordan, this invitation of this event to think of ourselves as researchers, to come together in a mood of research. This is a new kind of gesture, I think, that's trying to come into our movement, to really bring the activity of spiritual research right down into our daily lives and how we experience our daily lives and how we relate socially to one another. It's very clear in Rudolf Steiner's early epistemological works that he considered thinking itself. To think means to conduct spiritual research. He made it clear in his other works that to develop any of these higher organs he talked about, they all start from just our everyday thinking and feeling and perceptions. That is the starting point. And I just want to honor this this beautiful invitation of Ray and Jordan, that we come together here, not just to listen to other people's research and go home and think, that was fascinating, it was wonderful. But that we really are trying to come together as a research community. We're trying to cultivate the sense of one another as our fellow researchers. And of course, this experience of Alanis historically was very important, because at that time Alanis came to this experience that the thinking of that time, his thinking, which had received this kind of great legacy of Platonism out of the past, but his thinking could actually not reach up to the real dynamic life of the spiritual world. And so he renounced that path of being a teacher. And only almost 1,000 years later, Rudolf Steiner found a way to renew thinking, to invigorate thought itself. As we would say, to bring the will forces, the fire, the strength of the will right into the thinking, that thinking could become alive again and actually have this possibility of grasping in a living way spiritual realities. What a daunting thing it was. I mean, what an amazing thing it is. Most people, they encounter Rudolf Steiner's writings and it's like, what? This man claimed to be able to say things about such realities? It is daunting. It is amazing. But if we walk down this path and we start in a humble and simple way with our current experiences, then we realize that spiritual research is the substance, really, of how we are living our lives. And if we make that conscious, we can begin in very real ways to be spiritual researchers. And clearly, friends, this was Rudolf Steiner's hope. He did not found a school for spiritual research with the thought that only his research would be enshrined and worshipped for eternity. He wished to invite us all into this intimate inner workshop of being a researcher. So I just want to again acknowledge this beautiful invitation for each of us to take up the spirit of this event in a different way than just a conference, but it's really a coming together and a seeking to form a vessel together where spiritual research, where inner activity can be quickened. This is the question. Can we, through the way we work together in these days as a community, quicken the fire of research, the inner activity? And it has everything to do, I would suggest, with how we come together as a community. In my experience, when we gather in these events, these conferences like this, the spiritual world takes a great interest, because something becomes possible when we gather as a community that is not possible in the same way when we are doing our work alone. There are spiritual beings who come to meet us as a community that are different than the spiritual beings that are able to come to meet us as individuals. And the question is, do we receive them? Do we create a space through our social interaction, through the way we relate to one another, that these beings really can reveal their message to us, can speak to us, can live amongst us? Yeah, so you could say this event, the being behind this event wants to bring us certain tidings, wants to communicate with us. And it's a research question for us these days. Can we receive that? Can we develop a sense for that? In addition, in my experience, when we come together this way, there's a kind of temple space created spiritually, in which our individual questions can also receive answers in unique ways. So for me, it's always an important practice before I go to a gathering of some kind like this, to try to be clear in myself, what are the deep questions I'm living with at the moment? They might just be destiny questions, like, you know, how am I going to take care of my aging mother? Or they could be, you know, what we would call a research question in a more traditional sense. And if we clarify those questions to ourselves prior to or while we're in a gathering like this, I suggest to you that we can find that we get quickened. We become enlivened. Or maybe in the course of the event, we discover what the question was I was living with, that we weren't really conscious of. The reality is we live many of our deep questions in a kind of unconsciousness. And it's through the meeting with the other that these questions can come to life and wake up in us. Wow, I didn't even know I had that question, and I just got an answer to it. These things can happen in community life when we take hold of social life in a conscious way. When we practice the meeting with each other in a way that allows the spiritual beings that draw near these events to actually find a home. Now, what are those practices that can allow the spiritual world to really join us, to ray through our work together? Obviously, the first prerequisite is simply that we come here as individuals with a certain earnestness and with a certain inner work with spiritual science that we've already done as individuals. Yeah? I mean, this fire must indeed be burning in us, in a sufficient number of us here. But then there is the question of how we meet each other in the space, of how we speak to one another and listen to one another. Speaking and listening, these are like the breath that we create for the beings that would ensoul our gatherings, our communities, our institutions. The quality of speaking and listening. And you can also think of this in relation to the social motto that Rudolf Steiner gave, which I'd like to suggest to you is really an exercise. And the social motto reads something like, sorry, I'm getting warm. I think this happened 4 years ago. It's the lights up here, I get warm. The healthy social life is found when in the mirror of each human soul, the whole community finds its reflection. And when in the community The virtue of each one is living. So put very simply, in a certain way, diagrammatically, when in each human soul, the community as a whole finds its reflection. And when in the community, the virtue of each is living. This is somewhat analogous to listening and speaking. This mirroring process is a kind of listening, creating room in your soul for the community to resound, to echo, for the interests of others, the striving of others to find a place in you. And then there is this process of being willing to bring your virtue to the community, to be willing to bring yourself, to share what's living in you. This is analogous to the speaking. Let's try something for a moment. Could we? I'd just like to invite you all to stand up and take a moment to look around the room. Just quietly look and sort of behold the community that you will spend the next 2 or 3 days with. Just behold who you are with. What an opportunity to connect, to meet others who can quicken you and whom you can quicken. It's beautiful. You guys don't even want to sit down, I can tell. What a beautiful thing. Just look at each other. Go ahead and have a seat. But this is the question. This is the social formative question. The first one, are we willing to make room in our souls for the other? It might be just one other, but through that other, through that activity, you will connect with the spirit of the community. You will allow the spirit of the community to become active. What you generally find in groups is that there are people who are more comfortable listening and people who are more comfortable speaking. This is a classic polarity in group life, in social life. And generally, it is the ones who are listeners who have this talent for creating a space for the community in their hearts. Yeah? We can sort of picture Mary's relation to the disciples, this holding the wholeness in the heart. And those who speak, the act of speaking is related to this willingness to bring my virtue, to share. It could also mean just sharing my struggles. It doesn't just mean actually sharing only what's virtuous in us. It means being honest and vulnerable. And so I would encourage you in the social formation process of this weekend to maybe think a little bit about, are you someone who naturally likes to listen? To be a listener but not a speaker? And might it perhaps be an act of courage for you in, for example, the conversation groups or in the social time or in question and answer time to stand up and speak a question, to share? Or perhaps you are someone who likes to talk, is comfortable with that activity, and maybe it's developmental for you to practice holding back a little bit. Just hold back and listen a little more to the whole. So this social motto of Rudolf Steiner's is a real spiritual exercise that we can take up consciously in our gatherings, in our events, in our institutions. We must, friends, we must take it up consciously. I had the privilege as a young man to work in the Rudolf Steiner School in New York City for about a year and a half. And I had this wonderful role. I was doing an in-service training part of the time, and part of the time I was substituting for all the different classes and doing afternoon recesses. And what that meant was that I visited all the classes. I had time in almost every class to observe, to watch. And what I began to observe, first of all, was that I felt I could tell those teachers who were meditating on their children at night by the quality of interaction. There was a kind of way in which the children just immediately responded to the voice of the teacher. And those teachers who weren't doing that practice. But what I also noticed is that I had a very definite feeling that the teachers as a whole were not actually carrying one another. That the institution as a whole, that the adults were not carrying one another in the same way they were carrying the children. And I had this experience because I moved all throughout the school that the children were learning as much from the social life of the institution as a whole as they were learning in their individual classes. But the teachers weren't quite attending to this. And at the end of that year, I actually gave a little presentation to the teachers. I don't know what they thought about the idea of how this could be done, and about the, I had a sense then of the organism of the school. That the heart organ, which I felt were the faculty meetings, were not actually lively enough. They were too somber. They needed to be livelier. I won't go into this picture now. I might say more about it later, but this need to attend to the social processes in our gatherings and in our institutions really could not be greater. And in order to build on this, I want to share some of the core indications of Rudolf Steiner that are the source for the idea that there is a spiritual being connected to our communities. This is something now that's become sort of part of the culture of our movement, that we say, oh, the being of our school, or the being of our community. But I thought it would be good to take a moment and get grounded a little bit. Where does this idea come from in Rudolf Steiner's writings? What did he actually say about it? And I've just chosen two passages, and I think that they're revealing. Two passages, yeah, they're two parts of lectures. The first one comes from a lecture he gave, or a series of lectures that were published under the title Brotherhood and the Struggle for Existence. So Rudolf Steiner's talking about the relationship of the activity of cooperation to the activity of individuality. And so he says here, he says, in life, the struggle for existence has its justification. Because man is an individuality who has a single being, has to make his way through life. He is part of the struggle for existence. If we do not make ourselves capable of helping our fellow men, we shall be poor helpers. If we do not see to it that all our talents are developed, we shall be poor helpers. Then he goes on to say, obviously, this principle, which is necessary for man, can be developed to an extreme. But this principle will bear the proper fruits only when it is combined with that of brotherly love. It is correct to make oneself as strong as possible, but can we become strong at all without brotherly love? He who rises to a real knowledge of the soul must answer with a decisive no. And then he goes on to give this remarkable picture of association, of community. So let me just read a little bit of this to you. He says, association means the possibility for a higher being to express itself through the members when they are united. This principle is general for all life. 5 people together who think and feel harmoniously are more than 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. They are not just the sum of the 5, just as our body is not the sum of the 5 senses. Men's living together and within one another has the same significance as the living together of the cells within the human body. A new higher being is in the midst of the 5, yes, even amongst 2 or 3. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I shall be in their midst. But this can only happen when each lives selflessly in the other. This can only happen when each lives selflessly in the other. So you could say this idea that there's a spiritual being that ensouls our community life is only a possibility. It is not a given. It only happens when human beings think and feel harmoniously, when they find the ability to create harmony between their thoughts and feelings. Therefore, spiritual science does not talk in abstractions when it speaks of a folk spirit or folk soul, or a family spirit, or the spirit of some other community. He goes on, people who work together in a brotherhood are magicians because they draw higher beings into their circle. When we give ourselves over to brotherhood, this giving, this merging into the totality is a steeling, a strengthening of our organs. What a unique way to put it. So many of us think, oh, things are getting mushy, we're talking about our feelings, keep me away from groups. He's talking about something profoundly Michaelic. This merging into the totality is a steeling, a strengthening of our organs. When we then act or speak as members of such a community, it is not the single soul that acts or speaks in us, but the spirit of the community. Now, this is a whole other stage he's bringing it to that I'm going to want to elaborate on. When we then act and speak as members of such a community, it is not the single soul that acts or speaks in us, but the spirit of the community. This will be the secret of the progress of mankind in the future, to work through communities. Then he says, the Theosophical Society, of course he gave this lecture at the time he was part of the Theosophical Society. Some translations just remove that and say the Anthroposophical Society, wants to be exemplary in this respect. In this organization, one works through the labor of each individual member. He works best who does not want to push through his own opinion, but seeks to support what he observes in the eyes of his fellow brothers, who searches the thoughts and feelings of his fellow men and makes himself their servant. Within this circle, he works best, who in practical life does not regard his own opinions as most important. When we try thus to understand that our most valuable forces arise out of our society with one another, and that this society is not to be adhered to as abstract principle, but has to operate in every act, in every moment of life, then we shall progress. So this is a real calling of Rudolf Steiner to begin to work consciously. In fact, I think I left out a very important part of this quote where he says, yes, we must learn how to conduct community life. We must learn how to conduct community life. He's talking about becoming conscious of how we gather, how we meet, how we shape our institutions. And I think we know that this activity gets more complex at the institutional level. When we gather in a study group or in a conference, we could say it's truly a free association because we are unhindered by having responsibilities to carry out together. But that also makes them particularly beautiful, profound places where we can practice working consciously with these higher beings and meeting one another and harmonizing our thoughts together. Because it will become more difficult then at the institutional level when we must make decisions together, when we must manage finances together. And then we have to look out at the wider social organism. And this is what Rudolf Steiner intended to bring through social threefolding. That we actually look out at all of society as a living social formative process. And just as in our institutions we try and see, well, how are the different organs in our institution working? Is the heart healthy? Is the head healthy? Are the limbs healthy? Where is the liver in our school? What's its role? Who seems to really represent the liver function in our school? Yeah? This kind of activity then also must extend into the wider social life. So these three levels must be connected for the being of anthroposophy to really radiate through our movement. The free associations where we gather in small groups, in study groups, in conferences. The institutional life. Institutions need to be shaped out of a social consciousness and understanding. And then the wider social life we must be active in, or our institutions and groups will simply be swallowed by the deformities and misunderstandings living in the wider social order. These three are intimately connected. And my experience is that there are now on the earth a whole plethora of human souls who really are bringing this social consciousness, who wish to become part of our institutions and part of our groups because they need to bring this wisdom together with those who have the incredible thought, wisdom, capacities, and those who are the doers, who become the teachers and the doctors and the farmers. So there's like a new vocation emerging in our movement, and we need to become conscious of that. Young people are coming toward us, and others who maybe they want to be a doctor, but maybe they're also actually really interested in how the social life of our clinics can be healing. I don't think our movement can get on much longer with healing methods in classrooms that are impinged by unhealthy social life in the rest of the school, or impinged upon by unhealthy social conditions in wider society, that we are not active enough trying to transform. So, well, I think what I'll do first, I want to read you the second passage, and then I want to go on to something different. So I need to be sensitive to time here. Okay. Let me read you another passage from Rudolf Steiner. He brings another perspective on this. He says, "We stand today at a transitional point. Race will gradually disappear entirely, and something else will take its place. Those who will again grasp spiritual truth as it has been described will be led together of their own free will. Those will be the connections of a later age. The human beings of earlier times were born into the tribe, into the race. Later, we shall live in connections and associations which men create for themselves, uniting in groups with those of similar ideas while retaining their complete freedom and individuality. To realize this is necessary for a right understanding of something like the Anthroposophical Society. The Anthroposophical Society is intended to be a first example of such a voluntary association, although we may well be aware that it has not yet reached very far. The attempt had to be made to create a group in which men find themselves together without the differentiation of the ancient group soul's nature. And there will be many such associations in the future. Then we shall no longer have to speak of racial connections, but of intellectual, ethical, moral aspects with regard to the associations that are formed." Then he makes this interesting sort of sudden transition to describing more the inner process. The individuals voluntarily allow their feelings to stream together. And this again causes the forming of something which goes beyond the merely emancipated man. An emancipated human being possesses his individual soul, which is never lost when it has once been attained. But when men find themselves together in voluntary associations, they group themselves round centers. The feelings streaming in this way to a center once more give beings the opportunity of working as a kind of group soul, though in quite a different sense from the early group souls. All the earlier group souls were beings who made man unfree. These new beings, however, are compatible with man's complete freedom and individuality. Indeed, in a certain respect, we may say that they support their existence on human harmony. They live on human harmony. Their bodies are created by our social interaction. The more that men are divided, the fewer lofty group souls will descend into the human sphere. The more that associations are formed where feelings of fellowship are developed with complete freedom, the more lofty beings will descend, and the more rapidly the earthly planet will be spiritualized. So I'm going to go on. I do want to say I hope no one feels I'm beating a dead horse with this point. I think we have an incredible opportunity because the spiritual world is so eager to actively participate in our midst. So often, I'm aware that if human beings would just create a little more silence in a meeting, would say a verse a little slower. Friends, the saying of verses in our movement is becoming a bit formalistic, as though this is the way we begin and end things here. No, the saying of the verse, said properly, is the opportunity for the feelings to stream together toward a center, to be conscious of the spiritual being that wishes to be present in a given meeting. And so it takes great effort to try to actually be conscious of these things. But I want to make a bit of a transition now and try to, in a sense, I want to look at this archetype, or these archetypes of social interaction, in the light of the Anthroposophical society. Now, mind you, these archetypes exist everywhere. And I have to tell you, I attend a lot of conferences outside the Anthroposophical movement. And these identical social processes are happening in just about any conference where human beings are gathered with goodwill to do something good for the world. You can feel it. But I want to talk about them in more detail in relation to the Anthroposophical society, because I think many people here are very interested in the question of the renewal of the Anthroposophical movement. I think many of us are living with a sense that there's a possibility for a profound transformation of the Anthroposophical movement, a fulfillment of its promise. Yeah, that we're at these remarkable 100-year anniversaries from the founding deeds of Rudolf Steiner. And I think it's true to say, maybe it's not entirely accurate, that there's actually no one alive on the earth who encountered Rudolf Steiner as a living being. Maybe there are one or two still. But this is significant, you see, that the memories, the founding deeds, the echo of the founding deeds are fading. And if there's a hope for the Anthroposophical movement, it's in a kind of renewal out of the original spirit. The other reason I want to dwell on this, and the reason I think it's so important in terms of this question of spiritual research, is because, you see, it has to do with what actually happened at the Christmas Foundation meeting. Rudolf Steiner said that he had united the Anthroposophical movement and the Anthroposophical society. Now, what in the heck did he mean by that? My experience of what he meant, first of all, we have to understand that for Rudolf Steiner, the term Anthroposophical movement in that context was referring to the movement of spiritual beings working from the spiritual world to create the Anthroposophical movement. He was referring to the community of spiritual beings that stood behind his work. That is what he meant by movement in that context. And by society, he was referring to the community of earthly human beings who were trying to create a vessel for those spiritual human beings. And prior to the refounding of the Anthroposophical Society, you could say, from a certain perspective, the society was, and Rudolf Steiner himself at times referred it to this way, was a quasi-administrative body. He himself stood outside of it as an advisor. And he was the locus for the beings of the movement. And to some degree, he, with certain of his students, were the locus for these beings. And the society as a body, though he held these ideals for it, was again and again torn by incredible social strife and was not really an esoteric community until the refounding. Rudolf Steiner reached a point in his biography where he needed an earthly community that was carrying, that had a vertical relation to these guiding beings, and not just connecting to them through his personality, through him. And this is the mystery of the refounding of the Anthroposophical Society, was that it was an effort to form a community in which the guiding being of the community, in this case the being of Anthroposophia and the other beings associated with her, were actually livingly held through the kind of social processes I have described. If you go back and you read the transcripts, Rudolf Steiner speaks again and again about the harmony of human hearts. Again and again, he's calling for a harmony of human hearts so that these beings can begin to work through the community, which then liberate Rudolf Steiner to be active in this community in a whole new way, to actually take a leadership role. And so he made the decision, just before this refounding, he considered giving up on the society and just going and working with a very small group of students. But he chose not to. He chose to try to shape this community into a living esoteric body. And in doing that, he made this community responsible for the fate of anthroposophy in the world. Whether or not this community actually becomes a social, artistic, esoteric vessel has everything to do with whether Anthroposophia finds its way into the world. That is what he means by he joined the destiny of these two things. Whether or not we live up to the challenge of becoming an esoteric community has everything to do with whether our greatest hopes that anthroposophy rays out into the world and impacts the world. It's everything to do with that possibility. It is not dependent on whether a great initiate incarnates and comes and fixes everything. It's up to us. In fact, it's very clear that Rudolf Steiner made, that his own physical existence on earth he made dependent on this process, on this community formation process, that essentially the agreement he made with the spiritual world was that he could only remain on earth to the degree a living community vessel for the being of anthroposophy existed. His own forces became dependent on the community. And they remain so today, I would suggest to you. Whether or not Rudolf Steiner lives and speaks in our midst has everything to do with our ability to embody this social spiritual archetype of this community. So that is why I want to spend a little bit of time on this question, because I think it's worth it. And you can decide when I'm done whether it was worth it. What I will say is that I'm going to try to bring forth some of my own research now that I've really never brought forth before. I've never had much of an opportunity to. And of course, this is a challenge for a researcher, is that we need opportunities to share our research even when it's kind of tentative. This has been sort of a historical problem in the Anthroposophical movement, is we don't really want to put anybody on the stage until they're like, whams, just got it all down, perfect. But this is actually, it's understandable in certain conferences, but if we really want to foster the life of spiritual research, we are going to need to create much more informal opportunities for people to share their work and get peer feedback, etc. So, I'm going to be bold and try to dip into, try to deepen this discussion and look a bit at the archetypes of the society. And in doing this, I'm not trying to enshrine the structures that Rudolf Steiner created. I'm not trying to win anyone over to loyalty to those structures. Not at all. What I'm saying is, if we wish to renew those structures, transform them, metamorphose them, go beyond them, we have to know what the archetypes are. We can't just get around them. So, let me give you an example of what I mean, so this doesn't seem so abstract. And I have to think about whether this is the right place to start, though. Well, I'll start here anyway. As you know, the society has a structure, historically, that looks a little bit like this. There are, socially anyway, there are study groups, there are branches. In this country, there are these things called regional councils, there are national councils, and there's a worldwide leadership body. Okay? It's very clear from what I read there that Rudolf Steiner's intent was that the work done in these groups would, amongst other things, allow these different group soul beings to incarnate. And they are connected. They are connected with different scope of activity. So you could say at the study group level, we're working more with angels or perhaps angelic beings in transition to archangels. And so on. There's actually was an effort to incarnate hierarchical beings. Now, I'll tell you something Rudolf Steiner said about study groups that was very interesting. He said, if a study group is active in a particular community for 30 years, it can have the effect of completely transforming the soul spiritual atmosphere of that community. Now, what does he mean? He means that the group soul of that community, let's just say Philadelphia, okay, which I can assure you Philadelphia and every city in this country has a particular group soul spirit, is getting renewed by the new group soul that's active in the study group. There's a relation that's happening. This is an important possible area of research for study groups. It's an absolutely necessary area of research for national councils. Because national councils, in my mind, should be working consciously with the question of how is the being of this nation, whatever nation that is, working at this time. This is the question that these councils need to live with. How is the being of the nation working, the good spirit of the nation working? When I was on the Central Regional Council, we spent a lot of time really studying the forces in the middle of the country. How do they work? What's the history that's lived here? If we wish to renew civilization at the local and regional and national and worldwide levels, our interests must encompass the community around us. And this is a stage of development. A study group, in a healthy sense, starts with reading anthroposophical texts, but at some point in its maturation, the attention should turn out to the community. What's actually living in our community? Where are there Michaelites active? Where have there been Michaelites active? And then this becomes a deed for a study group to attend to what's actually living in the wider community, out of the rigor, the vitality of studying spiritual science. And at the worldwide level, the actual leadership body, some of you may be aware, is not the Vorstand. The Vorstand is the executive of the leadership body. The whole leadership body exists when the Vorstand meets with the general secretaries from all over the world. And it's in that meeting, organized properly, where the archive being, who's guiding this whole movement, can live and bring inspirations. And then these general secretaries ideally bring those inspirations to their national councils. And there becomes a weaving, a relationship here. Of course, all this depends on real consciousness, social process, consciousness. So that's an example. But I want to go back for a moment to something more archetypal in a sense, which is this process that Rudolf Steiner described in that first passage. And I want to try to summarize it in my own words, something like this. So we encounter anthroposophy as individuals. We take it up initially as individuals through our thought life. This he has described again and again, the importance. This leaves us our freedom. But that encounter also quickens us. We bring our will into our thinking. Our thinking begins to be enlivened by that process. And from there, that enlivened thinking brings about a flow of spiritual knowledge into our hearts. And this awakens love and interest in our fellow human beings. So this is a two-step process which is sort of archetypal. We come to anthroposophy through study as an individual, but generally we find ourselves in some kind of group. This is another stage of development where we practice. Initially, we're in a study group. We're really just getting helped as an individual to study, but eventually we are actually contributing toward the group becoming a vessel, an organ, a living organ. And Rudolf Steiner said that this group work could actually achieve something he called the reverse cultus, that a kind of sacramental process can happen when a group works together with sufficient life and vitality. But what then emerges organically from such a process, always in my experience, is this desire to ray out through action. This is generally the third step in our journey after studying and becoming part of a group, is often we want to act. We want to take up an anthroposophical vocation, Or we come to a conference like this, and by the end of the conference, we're inspired. We want to do something now with this incredible inflow. And this is precisely what Rudolf Steiner is describing here when he talks about acting or speaking as members of such a community. So there is a process, what I'm describing here, of turning inward with a community of people, turning toward a center, allowing our feelings to stream toward a center. And then, when that process goes well, it turns outward, and we feel drawn to radiate out, to carry outward into the world what we have received in this intimate gathering around knowledge and wisdom. We are drawn to the periphery to act. This is an archetypal community process. And we could ask, where's the archetype of that come from? And I would point you in two directions. One direction is the event of Pentecost, actually the whole mystery of Golgotha, where by the intimate relationship of the disciples to Christ, which reaches its culmination in the Last Supper, where Christ really gives over his whole being to the disciples. The teacher, the visible teacher, dies, leaves. This community goes through a crisis, but finds their way together again in an intimate way, in this case surrounded by the being of Mary. And out of that, this inspiring being descends powerfully, descends out of the grief, the loss, and now the disciples become apostles. They radiate out. And they gain a capacity to speak in a new language. A language that's no longer the mystery language they had with Jesus, with the Christ, but it's a language now that everyone can understand. This is the archetype behind this fundamental community process that Rudolf Steiner is describing. We study spiritual science. It unites with our being. It unites with our heart. We ray out to our brothers and sisters. We come into study groups and gatherings where we feel united. And if we do that work sufficiently, then, as we can often notice at conferences, we begin to feel inspired. Wow! And then we wish to radiate out. And when we radiate out, we're now carrying the life of the community. We're not just individuals. We're carrying the life of the community. The other archetype for this is in the Michael school itself, which Rudolf Steiner described, this supersensible school that took place between the 14th and the 18th centuries. And he describes this process. He describes, at the beginning of the Michael school, Michael is there as a teacher. He's teaching, he's bringing together all the wisdom streams of the world. But that teaching eventually gets transformed into imaginations. And a kind of cultus happens. A kind of cultus where the imaginations become a community vessel. They shape a community vessel. And then these imaginations, you could say, sink into the will of those who are present, and they develop the will to work, to carry forth onto the earth different activities. It is an archetype. And I notice it's an archetype really in every conference. This happens, and we could become conscious of it. In my experience, almost every conference wants to end with some kind of culminating social artistic event that we feel united, that the wisdom we learned from the lectures comes into a kind of a social cultus. And wishes to radiate out. Now, another way to look at that polarity, which I'm hoping it's not lost on anyone, is essentially, I believe, the same polarity that Frank was pointing to last night, of the connecting to the center versus the periphery. These are two archetypal gestures. They live in the human heart. They live in the process of community formation. And so, in my experience, the two cupolas of the Goetheanum, which I'm not going to be good at drawing, they are actually connected to these two. That the smaller cupola, where the Christ statue was meant to have been, is really connected to this intimate community-forming process around the mystery wisdom. And the second cupola is connected to this radiating out process to the periphery, connecting with the wider world. Now, I'm presenting them as kind of polaric, but clearly they are really intimately connected. Now, it's my experience that one of our social challenges in the Anthroposophical society is that we have communities of souls in our movement whose task is very connected to one of these gestures or another. This gesture of coming together around mystery wisdom and letting it permeate ourselves. This is a gesture that I personally believe is connected to the old souls, or what Rudolf Steiner called the Magi. They feel a particular connection to that, and this gesture of radiating out, of finding the language that speaks to the wider community, is connected to the younger souls. But actually, I would just put it that it's an old soul and a young soul gesture. Because at an individual level, you never really know. Not that you never really know, but there are many older souls who have taken on a responsibility for this gesture, and vice versa. But these communities are still at kind of a war with one another. I don't know if you pay attention to writings in the Anthroposophical movement, but there's a lot of people who feel that what we really need to do is to maintain our devotion to Rudolf Steiner and our devotion to the society, and this is how we will renew things. It's by staying true to the thought content that Rudolf Steiner brought. And then there's a whole other community that's like, forget that, man. Look at this incredible world situation going on here, and look at all the Michaelites working around us. We have got to get out and be part of this wider movement. These two poles are not in particular harmony in our movement. They are to some degree. But there's a kind of battle. Frank talked about a battle. And what we need profoundly is the working together, because our ability to radiate out into the wider world is intimately connected to our ability to do the inner work, to connect with these guiding spiritual beings. The apostles could not have done the work they did after Pentecost without having gone through this profound deepening. We need both gestures. And it's very hard. It's very hard to not get impatient or frustrated with the way some of our brothers and sisters are working and thinking. So just to build this imagination a little further, and I'm going to wrap up here shortly. So, well, there's a couple things I want to bring. I talked about sort of 3 stages of study: group process, learning to come together, learning to form community, conscious community, and then this action, radiating out, action. It is my the tentative results of my research is that these three activities are precisely what would have been deepened immeasurably in the three schools, the three classes of the School of Spiritual Science. The first class is, in the first place, a fundamental deepening of our individual spiritual path, our individual relation to the spiritual world, in the first place. In the second class, these mysteries of social formation would have been taught. The mystery of how to harmonize our karma with one another would have been worked with at a very deep level by Rudolf Steiner. In the third class, the training to perform occult deeds. Any act can be an occult deed with sufficient consciousness. This is when Rudolf Steiner would travel around Europe and give lectures. Each lecture, he was aware, was a deed. He was aware of how that lecture related to events happening in the world elsewhere. And something of that quality of deed. Rudolf Steiner talked about how his hope in the future that the Vorstand would recognize 4 times 12 individuals. He's talking about how just the power of recognizing another individual or a group of individuals can be an occult deed and can allow the guiding being that wants to work through those individuals to become active. The power of recognition. So, and this is part of the tragedy of the society, is that he was not able to found this second class. And this had so much to do with the resulting social tensions that led to the breakup of the Anthroposophical society, because that is where he really would have shown these incredibly strong individuals who had really awoken themselves from these different streams, how to harmonize their karma. And it was tragic, and it has remained tragic for our movement, that we've had all these strong individuals but kind of off doing their own thing. So that's the one thing. There's a school that would have cultivated specific social capacities. And again, I've laid this out very generally. I believe that each class would have been subdivided again. There would have been 3 sections to each school, and you would have seen something of this social process developed already in the first class, bringing the class lessons into conversation. And then this question of being a representative of anthroposophy touches on this third class. How does one represent anthroposophy, which Rudolf Steiner connected to that? But then we have this question of the sections. And around these sections we have institutions connected to them. We have a pedagogical section, we have Waldorf schools, we have an agricultural section, we have biodynamic associations and farms. But in our time, we have something much wider. We not only have our sections, we not only have our farms and schools, we are actually part now of a much wider Michaelic movement. A much wider movement. There's a holistic education movement. There's a holistic agriculture movement. There's a holistic medicine movement. There's movements for the transformation of science. We have Michaelites working powerfully out in this wider world. And the great thing that distinguishes these Michaelites from the Michaelites working through the society is that they are much more connected to the periphery. They don't associate themselves with some earthly center or history to the degree that we do. So on a global scale, I would say anthroposophists are like the Magi altogether. We're connected to this earthly center, this history, and the shepherds are out here working in these wider movements. And the question is, are we going to support our brothers and sisters in the work of founding a Michael culture, a Michael civilization, by bringing to life these community archetypes so that individual members of our community can ray out and do this work? Just as Frank was talking about, are we as a community going to make it possible for the right inspirations to come down to earth, and for certain individuals to have the forces, the strength, the resources they need then to work out and connect and be part of the wider Michael movements on the planet right now? And my experience is, as powerful as, let's say, the organic farming movement is, as extraordinary as it is, it wouldn't have come into being without the help of the biodynamic movement. There's a whole history there of how from behind the scenes, biodynamicists helped this movement come into being, and it won't fulfill its promise unless biodynamicists who are conscious that there's a spiritual being working in the organic movement, a powerful spiritual being. These new group souls are not only working in anthroposophical circles, they are active, all these incredible associations that are forming, nonprofit organizations that are forming all over the planet. They are the expression of the working of these group souls that Rudolf Steiner described. But they need the support of those who are conscious of where the inspiration comes from and who can participate in these movements. This is part of the mystery of the Anthroposophical Society. The mystery was never that this community would do everything the planet needs to turn to the good, that somehow the Anthroposophical Society would be the central home of the worldwide social change movement. But the intention was that a very profound collaboration and working together of spiritual beings happen. And that is really largely what a section was meant to be. When we see a crisis or something remarkable happening in the world, like Arab Spring, for example, well, this should have happened decades ago, but there should be a section formed, an occult group formed that's working deeply with what's really going on here. What's the history of the Middle East? What's really happening? And that can help, that activity can help the spiritual beings trying to incarnate through Arab Spring to do so in a healthy way, because there's some group over here that's actually attending spiritually to what's trying to happen. Anyway, it's getting late and I'm yammering on and on. I apologize for how platonic this is, and if it seems like, wow, Robert, you just took us a long ways away. But I felt in the invitation from Jordan the willingness to have me lay out some of this. And as I said, I feel that whether or not we have some special devotion to the Anthroposophical Society or not, these are real archetypes that we can work with. We can work with them in a very humble way. We can work with them in the next 2 days. How do we meet one another? Do we create a space in our soul for the being of this conference to live? Are we willing to share out of ourselves what our real burning questions are, what our existential questions are? To be vulnerable with one another. And it would be a deed for us in these days just to allow the good spirit of this event to be really present, really active. So thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.